Greetings and welcome again. Today I'll continue the presentation on writing for story. Before I get into that, you should know that I've given you two writing assignments for this week. One is due Wednesday by midnight. The other is due Friday by midnight. I don't think you'll find either of them overwhelmingly difficult, but keep checking Schoology because I am updating it as things unfold. I've also got on Schoology, before you do the writings, there's a folder called readings, and in that are the texts of a few brief readings that I want you to do before you try the writing. And they're not informational so much as they are inspirational and providing models. I think they will help. I hope you just get into the idea of writing your own stories. It is 1:43 and it's over. Dr. Ducker bites grimly into the sandwich, the Montster one. Just notice how much work that last detail, Dr. Ducker bites grimly into the sandwich. Notice that although it's quiet and you could read it without paying a lot of attention to it as a writer, it really does say something. It says, what happens after this horrific day in surgery in which he fails and his patient dies on the operating table? What does he do next? Well, what he does next is he eats lunch. And what that tells you, he isn't really crushed or defeated. It tells you also that tomorrow he'll be back and he will try again. And so that verb, Ducker accepts defeat, he accepts defeat, but he isn't defeated. He is going to eat. He is going to go on living. So that idea that a resolution is an action by the character. And years ago, I was working with some high school students in Libby on writing narratives. They weren't doing personal narratives, but they were doing true narratives that they researched in the history of their town. And one of the students, Rachel Reckon, began reading she was trying to get a better idea of the guy who owned the lumber mill in Libby. And she was interested in him because he kept the lumber mill open and operating through the Great Depression, even though he was losing money. And the focus of her overall essay was on how did people in Libby cope with the Great Depression. What she found about the guy, and she found this by reading the old business records in the museum, which included letters back and forth between the guy who was running the mill and his father, who had paid for building the mill. And one of the issues that she found in those letters was that the guy who was owning the mill, who kept it open, loved music. He loved the piano, and so he was spending kind of a fortune on a grand piano out in Libby, Montana, in the middle of the Depression. And the essay mostly dealt with the series of complications between that mill owner and his father and their disagreement over whether spending thousands of dollars on a piano was a good thing to do in the middle of a depression when the business is losing money. And it was a fairly long essay, but the way Rachel ended it, I think, was as good as professionals ever do. She didn't explain, she showed you something which told you what you wanted to know about that main character. That's Rachel. She was speaking at a conference we did in Helena. But she ended the essay. She'd found the story about that mill owner who had bought the piano. Later in life, he had some medical problems and he had to get his shoulder repaired. And this is what went on at the doctor's office in that event. Many years later, when doctors told him that his shoulder would have to be pinned into a single position for the rest of his days. George Niels sat down at the doctor's table and positioned his arm as if he were playing the organ. That's the way he wanted it, said Kenneth, for the rest of his life. Okay, and Kenneth, of course, is George's son, who was alive and who Rachel interviewed for this story. But she ends with an action by George Niels that it isn't a big flashy thing like an explosion or anything. It's just later when he had to get his shoulder pinned, he made a choice which kind of lets us see what was important to him, what he was all about. Very effective ending. Show, don't tell. Finding stories, looking for stories. No, Rachel just did a really good job, because I don't think anybody ever before had connected what happened to George at the end when he had his shoulder surgery with the conflict that had gone on years before between him and his father about a piano. It was finding those details and seeing what they could be, what you could make of them, that led Rachel to writing a really good story. So look for fabulous realities. That's the writer's work anyway. Be awake to the world around you. The phrase fabulous reality comes from a quote by Henry David Thoreau, of course, who wrote a book called Walden, which was all first-person narrative about his decision to go live in a cabin by the woods, kind of separate himself to some extent from noisy urban technological society. In that book, Walden, he says, shams and delusions are esteemed for the soundest truth, while reality is fabulous. We live this mean life because our vision does not penetrate the surface of things. So he's saying if you can really see the world around you, you will escape the what he's calling a mean life, which would be a low life, not a high life, not having a high, but just kind of trudging through things. A fabulous reality is a detail, like a dirty, barefooted, stringy-haired girl smoking a cigarette and eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich while she's writing on the subway reading How to Win Friends and Influence People. Just give me that fact. You don't need to explain. I get an emotional charge from it. Or a gawky middle school girl dressed in a sexy top with flawless written on it in sequins, who's wearing a Winnie the Pooh backpack on her back. Or two old men in a nursing home angry because a resident's dog has been barking too much. And so they're leaning on their walkers outside their apartment, barking back every time the dog barks. A writer learns to see things, to really see the world that's around. We can develop a sharp eye to observe and a sharp ear to hear the sights and sounds of everyday reality, the texture of the ordinary, to find, as William Blake said, infinity in a grain of sand, eternity in an hour. If you can recognize the ordinary drama of everyday life and see that it's not ordinary at all, it's unique, unrepeatable. It's kind of what the invitation to write a personal narrative is to find and include some of those kinds of details from your life, which may seem insignificant and ordinary, but really is quite amazing and completely unique. Just another example from students I've worked with before. This was by Brittany Maddox, who was a junior in Ronan High School when she wrote this essay, but what she was doing was oral history. That was the assignment all the kids had. She decided to do an interview with her grandmother, which Oma in German means grandma. She wanted to talk to her because she knew that she had been forced into Hitler's youth in Germany during World War II. And And kind of what was interesting, Brittany came up with such profound insights in the process of telling that story. It was interesting to listen to it because at the beginning she's quoting her grandmother, and as she goes along, Brittany's voice more and more starts to sound like her mother. It's like listening to her read the paper. You could almost see and hear the experience of Alma's model and example kind of changing Brittany. But when she tells the story, the insights she found weren't new. I mean, she came up with things like we need to persevere through adversity. We need to stay true to our values, no matter what pressures put on us. We need to stand with our family and friends. And all of those things are cliches, but they're still true. They're still important. And at the level of the theme, we don't need new things. And I think a lot of modern writers think that they do need to come up with something new. And I think it's part of the reason that so much contemporary fiction writing is so bad. I mean, nobody reads it. Fiction novels don't have anywhere near the cultural power they had a generation ago. And the best-selling sorts of writing now, it's no longer fiction. It is nonfiction, true stories about people's personal experiences. And Willa Cather said this. It's so true, though. There are only 2 or 3 human stories, and they go on repeating themselves as fiercely as if they had never happened before, like the larks in this country that have been singing the same song, 5 notes, for over 1,000 years. So don't worry too much if you think your story is ordinary, or if you think it doesn't have any grand new, surprising moral or theme. It doesn't need to. What we keep going back to story, and what we're looking for really is sharing other people's experiences. The fact that everybody maybe has fallen in love at some point doesn't mean they won't be interested in hearing the very particular details of how that happened to you. Where were you at? What was it like? Bill Kittredge, who was one of Montana's best-known writers at the time I was in the MFA creative writing program at the University of Montana, I ran into him downtown and at a cafe, and he just came up and talked to me on his way out. And he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm writing poetry. And he said, oh, don't do that, write short stories. And then he said, you're from St. Ignatius, aren't you? And I said, yeah. He said, that is so good. I mean, everybody in the world wants to know what it's like. I mean, if you can just tell a true story about what your household was really like, what your family was really like, what happened when you got up in the morning. I mean, you're moving through a world that is so exotic and unknown to most people. And I think Montana literature, it's gone through a period of being really fashionable in the law. I mean, a lot of Montana writers have made it really big. And I think it's partly just because of that advantage we have living in a place. What seems ordinary and everyday and not worth noticing to you isn't. I mean, it isn't. It isn't because you're here, but your stories, well told with detail, setting, character, dialogue, they can be as good as stories get. I mean, take the challenge, turn your life into some really good literature. Okay, check out the website. As I said, there's some reading assignments on there I want you to do. They're not long, and there's 2 writing assignments that I want you to work on this week, one due Wednesday and one due Friday. They aren't hard or difficult, but I do want you to get started on writing your personal story, the final draft of which will be due at midterm.